Oh, high-res audio. Then it has to be good, right? Hey, Julian Kraus here, and you might have noticed from my slightly ironic intro that I'm not a big fan of marketing stickers, and that's why we're going to have a look at the real performance of the iFi ZEN Air DAC, because it promises a pretty compelling performance for its price. And of course I'll go over all the pros and cons I found while testing this DAC and headphone amp combination. Let's have a look at the hardware first. The DAC is pretty light, and that's because the housing is completely out of plastic. Not too much of a complaint in this price range, but the plastic could have been 0.5 mm thicker, as it has quite a bit of give if you squeeze it a bit. The important part though is the one that you will interface with the most, and that's your knob. The volume knob of the ZEN Air DAC, of course. It has a metal shell and it turns extremely smooth and feels much higher quality than you would expect from this price range. On the front you can find a few more controls, namely the so-called power match button, which I will explain a little later in the video, and another button that iFi calls XBass Plus. This is essentially a bass boost, but also more on that later. On the far left you have an LED indicator which changes color depending on the mode that the DAC is in. It will change depending on whether it plays back DSD, PCM or MQA files, and also changes with the sample rate. And lastly, on the front of the ZEN Air DAC you can find a 1/4 inch headphone connection, because the Air DAC is not only a DAC, but it also features a headphone amplifier. On the back there are a few more connections, a pair of RCA connectors, as you would expect from an unbalanced DAC. There's also a USB Type B to connect the ZEN Air DAC to your PC or smartphone. In the year 2022 I would have definitely liked to see a USB-C connection here, especially because the ZEN Air DAC is quite portable and a USB-C connection would have made the connection to a smartphone much easier. Next to it you get a DC barrel connector, which can be used to power the DAC when the USB connection does not deliver enough power. For PCs this isn't an issue and they will work just fine with only the USB connection. The included cable is quite short, 50 cm to be exact, and I find this to be an odd choice. It might be fine for mobile use, but then again I would have expected a USB-C connection and not a USB Type A cable. If you want to use the ZEN Air DAC in any kind of desktop setup, there is a very good chance that the included cable is not long enough and you will end up buying another USB cable. Or steal one from your printer. This is anyways a good idea because in one of my ZEN Air DACs the USB cable got stuck and there is just no way of removing it. iFi said that this has been a production issue with the cable and it has been resolved, but with the earlier units this is definitely something that can happen. You have been warned. One thing I also noticed is that the volume control is very close to the desk, and when you want to do bigger volume adjustments your finger goes under the dial and then you lift up the whole unit. Or you're forced to use the crab technique to incrementally change the volume. But you can solve that by simply placing it onto something to slightly elevate it from the desk. The thing that cannot be solved though is the volume dial gets extremely difficult to use when you plug in headphones. Especially if they're using a bigger plug or you're using an adapter, then you can only touch the dial on the top and it's frustrating to use. This is a really weird design choice. Placing the headphone connector just a bit further to the right would have solved this completely, but that's how it is. By the way, when you plug in a pair of headphones, the RCA outputs on the back are not muted, so the headphone output and the RCA always play simultaneously. This has pros and cons and you decide if that's what you want. Okay, let's dive a bit deeper into audio quality and I will also show you the effect of the power match and XBass Plus and start with the RCA output. You can see that the frequency response of the RCA output is extremely flat, even above and below the human hearing range. In fact, the frequency response stays flat all the way down to single-digit frequencies. That's an excellent response. With the sample rate set to 48 kHz, the response rolls off around 24 kHz, which is as it should be. One bug I found in the firmware version 7.4 is that when you have the sample rate set to 192 kHz, it still seems to operate at 96 kHz internally. When I play a 90 kHz tone, which is normally inaudible, you can see that it aliases back down into the audible range, which indicates that the DAC is actually not running at 192 kHz. If this gets fixed, I will let you know in the comments. Until then, I would avoid the 192 kHz setting and use 96 kHz at the maximum. While we're talking about the software, there is another thing I noticed. When I start audio playback, for example for a YouTube video or Spotify, then the ZEN Air DAC always takes about half a second until the sound starts playing. The signal running through the... Having the gain to fine adjust the signal level is professional line level signal going straight into the the return and this bypass. I found this very annoying because if you're quickly skipping through an audio track or a video, there's always a tiny bit of lag until you hear the audio. This was reproducible on multiple PCs, and it does not matter whether I installed the iFi driver or not. I was actually in contact with iFi about this issue, and they indicated that this might only be an issue with my particular unit. So I did the only logical thing in that case. I bought a second unit. And lo and behold, it's exactly the same. I expect this to be fixed with a firmware update. Again, check the comments. Until then, this is a super annoying bug, and I really hope that they get this sorted, as this is a big no-go for me and I have never experienced something like this with any other DAC I own. But back to the audio performance. You might have noticed that this is a slightly different scale to how I normally display the response. And the reason for this is that the red line of the XBass Plus would have otherwise not fit onto this graph. As you can see, the XBass Plus creates a whopping 10 decibels of bass boost at 20 Hz because fuck you, bass, to keep it in the words of Chronicle. But in all seriousness, you will notice this. This is not a gentle bass increase, this is a significant bass boost, and it can oftentimes be too much for speakers, because the bass goes down to subsonic frequencies. Especially on smaller bookshelf type speakers, this results in the membranes just flopping about with deep bass music, and at 10 Hz hardly any speaker has a meaningful output. And then the XBass Plus just puts the speaker at risk of hitting its excursion limits. Instead of this heavy boost, I would have liked to see more settings, maybe 3, 6 and 9 dB boosts, where 3 and 6 would be much more useful for the output of a DAC. One thing I have to hand to it though is that the boost starts nice and low and does not increase the mid-bass area too much, which is incorrectly done way too often. So this is a good sounding bass boost. Now let's talk about the maximum output level, because here's where it gets a bit weird. I would have expected the RCA output to have a maximum output level of 2 volts to adhere to the Redbook standard, but it actually only has 1 volt at the maximum volume setting unless you turn on power match. Then the DAC even outputs a 3.3 volts. But I don't really understand why power match does even affect the RCA outputs. There is a good reason to have this feature for headphones, and I will get into that later, but why you would integrate this also for the RCA output is beyond me. I mean, it's not a big deal, you can simply turn on power match and then turn the volume dial to roughly this position and then you will get about 2 volts. Still, I think the power match feature shouldn't affect the rear output, and at the max volume setting the DAC should deliver 2 volts to begin with. By the way, noise is also affected by the power match setting, that's the whole point of it. I measured the dynamic range, which is the ratio of the maximum output, and the noise floor, and you want this to be as high as possible for minimal noise. With the power match off, the ZEN Air DAC delivers 107 and with power match on 110 dBA. That's quite good, although not record-breaking. Realistically speaking, there's no chance that you will hear this noise regardless whether you have power match on or off. One more thing to mention is that the power match does have an impact on the distortion of the RCA output. Here you can see the THD plus N versus amplitude graph, and at first the line goes down linearly, which is what we expect to see in the noise limited region, but then the distortion starts to come in and the line rises again. At the Redbook standard of 2 volts, the ZEN Air DAC has a THD plus N of -69, nice, 0.6 dB. While this is still okay, and I doubt that you will hear this distortion, it is definitely nothing to write home about, and in fact not too far off of what the built-in audio in your PC can achieve on its own. So a bit of a lackluster performance here. Even in this price range I do expect better nowadays. Okay, enough about the RCA outputs, let's hop over to the headphone connections. First up, of course, frequency response. And this is quite boring, and in a good way, because this is literally the same as for the RCA outputs. Nice and flat all the way from subsonic to ultrasonic frequencies. Great stuff. You know, I'm a bit of a basshead myself, and I have to say that I quite like XBass Plus with open back headphones that have a natural bass roll-off, because XBass can counter this roll-off effectively. Maybe sometimes a bit too well. With closed headphones, which have an already substantial low bass performance, the XBass Plus gets quite ridiculous. So I can only repeat what I said before for the RCA outputs. This mode would have been so much more useful if it had 3, 6 and 9 dB steps. Oh well. One more thing to mention is that the XBass does increase distortion while simultaneously reducing headroom. Here you can see the total harmonic distortion plus noise versus power graph for a 50 Hz tone. Without XBass Plus, the distortion kicks in at about 3 mW. With the XBass Plus enabled, the distortion starts way earlier and levels out around -55 dB. With specific test tones I could hear this amount of distortion, but under normal listening circumstances this is mostly inaudible. But you definitely have to be careful when using XBass Plus in conjunction with Power Match. As a baseline you can see a 50 Hz tone. Ha, see what I did here? Baseline, 50 Hz. Tough crowd. When I now turn on the XBass, the signal level increases, but so does the distortion. That's what we've already seen in the other graph before. But when I also engage Power Match in this setup, you can see that this is plainly clipping. That's because the combined boost of XBass and Power Match and a high volume setting can overload the headphone amp. So if you have Power Match and XBass enabled, do not go over 60% on the volume dial. Everything above that will result in plainly audible distortion. You have been warned. Besides that, the Power Match feature can be quite useful. If you use sensitive IEMs, on some devices you tend to be stuck with only a small useful range of the volume dial, because higher volume settings are already too loud. But with more power-hungry over-ear headphones, you typically need more power. So if you have the Power Match off, the ZEN Air DAC outputs a lower level, and then you also have about 5 dB lower noise, which is ideal for sensitive IEMs. With Power Match enabled, the maximum power output of the amp increases, which can be helpful to power more demanding headphones. This feature can be handy to have, especially if you switch between IEMs and over-ear headphones on a regular basis. You can also see this in my overview chart. Without Power Match you have less output and less noise, and with Power Match you got more output, but you also have a slightly higher noise floor, but it's still very good. One more reason why you would want to use Power Match is that with very low volume settings, the left and right side on your headphones can start to have a slight difference in volume. That's because analog volume controls are less precise in that regard. So if you always listen at low volume settings, with Power Match off, the left and right channel were better matched to lower volume settings. I also measured the crosstalk, which indicates how much audio from one channel leaks into the other. Too much of that and this degrades the stereo image. Here the ZEN Air DAC does perform decently. Definitely not the best performance I've ever seen, but still low enough to not have any audible effects. And one more thing I skipped over in the beginning is the output impedance, which should be low to not have any negative effects on the frequency response. The ZEN Air DAC is pretty much perfect in this regard, with a near zero impedance, which is exactly what I want to see. All in all, the iFi ZEN Air DAC is a medium performer. In terms of its technical performance, it has some strong points, like a quite high output power, which means that you will be able to drive most headphones to loud listening levels. But it definitely does not win any prizes for its THD performance. I mean, I've literally measured $10 USB dongles that offer lower distortion. That said, the audio quality is already quite good and most people will be very happy with the sound of the ZEN Air DAC. And it does offer some additional features like a smooth analog volume control and Power Match and XBass Plus. The biggest issues I found with the ZEN Air DAC is that the volume dial gets very tricky to use when you got headphones plugged in, and the issue with the audible lag when the audio starts playing in firmware 7.4, which is a showstopper for me. The latter one will hopefully be fixed via firmware, but the first one is sadly down to a bad hardware design. If you're searching for a DAC and headphone amp with the highest technical performance, I think the ZEN Air DAC is not for you. But if you're searching for an affordable DAC and headphone amp combination that will happily drive the majority of headphones, also offers a handy Power Match feature to tailor the output to IEMs and headphones, and the XBass Plus feature for a huge amount of sub-bass, then the ZEN Air DAC might be interesting for you. Again, provided that they fix the audio lag bug with a firmware update. I will keep you posted with a pinned comment. Alright, like, subscribe and all that good stuff, and I will see you all in the next one.